record. Okay. Pretty small. Get everything set up. Okay, very good. Erev Tov. What we left off was discussing Rabbenu Tam. Rabbenu Tam, a grandson of Rashi. And we talked about two of his most famous enactments. One of the idea of a different order in the Shel Rosh, on the head for the tefillin, the order the Parshiot are in there. We also talked about his enactment of Shabbat ending later than what he considers Tzeitat Kochavim, is approximately half an hour after the time you'll find on most calendars. And I said they were left off. What we're going to talk about this week to pick it up with him is, besides making other enactments and everything else, is something that he also decreed, having to do with a blood libel in the city of, it's pronounced Blois, B-L-O-I-S. It's spelled B-L-O-I-S, looks like Blois, but it's Blois. It happened the 20th of Sivan in 1171, and he decreed a public fast day. Just a minute, I'm going to get a drink of water. Just hang on. Okay. So anyways, a couple of people just joined us. And we're in the process of discussing once again Rabbenu Tam, and he decreed a public fast day in 1171 because of something that happened in the city of Blois. In 1171, in the French town, there was a, lose my voice here, a local Christian who claimed to have seen a Jew throw the corpse of a child into the river. The fact that there was no child reported missing, the fact that there was no corpse ever found, there was a lack of witnesses. So what? Who cares? So there were Jews who were arrested in the town. They were arrested and they were tortured. The original, the leader of the community was called the Count. His name was Theobald V. I guess the other four were dead. And he said, we'll be willing to free the Jewish captives on one condition: you have to pay a very large ransom. And we're going to talk about the topic of ransom in a little while. We talked about the Maram Rutenberg. Anyways, there was a bishop that intervened and said that the servant's testimony was actually was by ordeal, meaning that he was tested. If the servant was telling the truth, he would see if the witness would float on the water. And he says, well, that didn't happen. The ransom negotiations fall apart. The Count gave the prisoners a choice. He said, either they can be baptized. Now remember, it's basically been proven it was false, but nevertheless, who cares? The prisoners could choose to either be baptized or, because they had nothing else to do, to be burned alive. This is a theme that will be played out over the centuries. We'll see this when we talk about Spain once again, and we'll talk about the expulsion of the Jews of Spain in 1492. But at this time, almost everyone decided to give up his life and be burned, literally burned at the stake. On May 26th, which was corresponding to the 20th Sivan of the year 1171 of the Common Era, 31 Jews, including 17 women and some children, were tied up and burned at the stake. As a result of that particular tragedy, the Jews of England, France, the Rhineland, along with Rabbenu Tam, declared that the 20th day of Sivan should be a fast day for atonement. Shortly thereafter, on the 4th day of Tammuz, Rabbenu Tam died. It was only 3 weeks later. And there are those who've written about this historically, that he was so overcome with grief that it's what killed him. Even though this wasn't the first blood libel, it was the first in which the government openly participated in it. It lays the pattern for many, many more over the years. Eventually, we're going to talk, some of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Bayless case in Kiev, We'll talk about that. But this really was like the forerunner of so many different instances of the blood libel. In addition to that, we also understand that the Rabbenu Tam instituted an idea that the cherem, that if someone were, once a get is given in a Beit Din, the legitimate Beit Din, and yes, there are illegitimate Beit Din, once in a Jewish court gives a divorce from a man to a woman, that if a person comes to question the validity, that person could in theory be put in a cherem, which means excommunicated. That was one of his enactments. In addition to that, remember, we're still in the time period of the Crusades. Remember, that's why we started talking about this whole time first about the Crusades. So in 1146, a mob enters Rabbenu Tam's home, robs his stuff. He himself is in mortal danger. This is before, obviously, he's dead, just a few years before. His life was spared because of some of the local noblemen to whom he was, I guess they were friendly, but he promised his attackers, this nobleman, that no worries, I'm going to get this Rabbenu Tam man to convert to Christianity. Obviously, that didn't happen. The idea of setting up a date for a special fast, we're going to see in a little while this evening a different event that happens, and about a fast day as well. But we're going to come back to that in just a bit. We're going to now talk about the people who are in the time period of Rabbenu Tam, the Rashbam, his brother. I said that this is the beginning of the time period of what was known as the Baal HaTosafot. Baal HaTosafot, Tosafot mean additions. So it's pretty much like a scholarly analysis of the Gemara, and it also discusses Rashi's commentary on the Gemara. Most of the people who are mentioned in Tosafot, in Talmud Bavli, it's not in Talmud Yerushalmi at all, in Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, most of them lived in the area of the Ashkenazi world, northern France and Germany. That's where most of them lived. And also in England, Austria, Central Europe, which today would be the Czech Republic. So it's interesting how pretty much in the European, in Europe, we have not only Rashi, who is the first major commentator on the Gemara, and of course on Chumash, you have his grandsons who are two generations later, who are making available more information for the Gemara for us to understand. Now, I'm just going to pop one thing on the screen here. Just one brief example of what Tosafot does. It's hard to say because we say that Tosafot really is plural, means additions. So you should say do, but whatever. Many people use this in singular as well. Okay, so let's take a look. So this is a Gemara in the second parak of Shabbat. Let's make it big. You'll all be familiar, I believe, with the Mishnah. I'm just going to read the first line, and then we'll see what bothers Tosafot and what they write. Mishnah starts off. When it comes to the Shabbat candles, the lights for Shabbat, with what can you light, and what you're not allowed to light with? And the whole discussion is that because certain things they don't. We're talking usually oil or other methods. It wasn't a candle; it was oil or other things that had a wick. So if it didn't light well, there's a potential chashash or concern that someone might move the little oil lamp or move the wick, and which you can't do on Shabbat. So the question the Mishnah starts with is, what are the things you are allowed to use to light Shabbat lights? And what can you not light with? Then the Mishnah continues. It lists things that you cannot use to light Shabbat candles. Something bothered Tosafot about this. Let's take a look up here. Right here. This is in the Rashi script, even though, again, remember, we learned Rashi never saw it. So Rashi and Tosafot, it addresses a problem or a question that should pop into everyone's head. Because the Mishnah says, with what can you light, and with what can you not light? And then it starts to enumerate the things that which you cannot light. So Tosafot says, Pamim mefaresh my desalik bine, upamim pamim vemed shehitchil. The question, Tosfot, now again, very much like Rashi, they don't spell out all the time what their question is. Sometimes they do, which they'll introduce with words like V'im Tomar, and if you want to say, or Vikasha, the problem is, but this time they're only anticipating your question and they're giving the answer. What's the question? It says, what can you light with and what should you not light with? And then it goes ahead and starts to explain things that you shouldn't light with. Or if you're going in order, the Mishnah starts off with the question of, what can you light with? So that should be the first thing they discuss. So Toso tells us, he answers the question. Sometimes sometimes the Mishnah picks up on the last statement of a if or when yes and when no. And sometimes it goes back and refers back to the first statement, the first clause of the question. So in other words, they say, don't worry about it. It's a very common act that we see in the Mishnah, where they will not necessarily follow the order of the initial statement. Okay. So, like I said, that was just an example of something that Tosfot does for us. It's usually written in a question-answer format, but not always. Very often, as I mentioned, they will reference Rashi. They'll start off by saying, Perush HaKuntres. Kuntres, remember, he says Rashi, he says, et cetera, and they say we don't understand it because they bring questions and answers. And sometimes the length of Tosfot is very, very short. That one was very short. And sometimes they're massively long. And there's one Tosfot that goes like, let's say, I've seen many like that goes an entire page. And then the end just says like, okay, we shouldn't discuss this anymore. It's already gone on long enough and we have to come to a conclusion. Sometimes they'll rule on halachic matters. Not always. Not always do they come to actual conclusions. But it's there for, so if they don't come to a conclusion, why discuss it at all? Because in the year 2024, Tafshin Pei, someone might be sitting in the Beit Midrash somewhere in Yerushalayim or the United States somewhere. They'll see that the one Gemara they learned in Masechet Bechorot says one thing, and Masechet Chagiga says another thing, and they contradict each other. Well, now what? What am I supposed to do with that information? So very often when you see that the Gemaras seem to contradict each other, you'll very often find in one or the other, and sometimes in both, you'll find Tosfot makes a comment to try to reconcile that. That's their job, so to speak. There's some names that you will have heard of, some maybe not, that I mentioned. Rabbenu Tam, as I mentioned. The Ri is Rabbi Yitzchak HaZaken, the Ri. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher, the Riva. Rabbi Yehuda ben Natan, the Rivan. The Rivam, Rabbi Ezra of Tok, excuse me. Many of them were either sons-in-law or grandsons of Rashi, as I mentioned. And once again, I think it's important to note that there's no such thing as a uniform length of Tosfot. Okay, that's fine. So that's the commentaries on the Gemara, the two main ones, which are Rashi and Tosfot. We are now in the middle of the 1200s, in the 13th century still. Again, it's important to keep in mind the last number of classes, going back all the way to the summertime, where we were discussing the time period of the Golden Age of Spain. So right now we're entering approximately the time of the Rambam in Spain, but we're now still in Germany, or in Europe rather. And we're going to talk about Maharam Rutenberg, Rabbi Meir Rutenberg. And it's also the same time that's during still the Crusades are going on. They're not as strong as they had been in the beginning, but it's still happening. I've mentioned since we started this class, and I mentioned it also when we talk about Rambam, we talk about Rashi, that there are certain inflection points within Jewish history of individuals, whether it was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who then made the decision to write down the Mishnah, the Torah about that, whether before him, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, to try to reestablish the headquarters, so to speak, of Israel, instead of being in Yerushalayim, to be in Yavne temporarily. Whether it was jumping ahead to some recent Rashi, who opened the door for us to be able to learn Chumash and Gemara at a much better level of understanding. The next man, Rabbi Meir of Maharam Meir Rutenberg, or Rabbi Meir of Rutenberg, is one of those people as well. But for more than the reason of he did a lot of writing, even though he became, at this time, he becomes like the main chief Ashkenazi authority in Europe of his generation. It's not the reason. It's because who his students were and what they did. Let's say, for example, There is no such thing as the computers. Computers don't exist yet. And somehow I discovered the idea of a circuit board. I figured that out. Now, does that make me the father of the computer generation? Not necessarily. I just discovered this idea that information can be saved on a chip, let's say. And on a circuit board, let's talk about a chip. Well, what happens with that chip? And how's it used? So by that point, I'm out of the picture. And now other people come along and they figure out how to make something called a processor to make the speed faster. Keep in mind that the computer you have on your phone is much, much, much more sophisticated than the computer that sent man to the moon in 1969, July 20th, 1969, when we landed on the moon, walked on the moon. So things have changed. But the fact that I might have been the person, let's go back, many, many years, and discover the idea of a microprocessor, I discovered the idea of making a chip or whatever it might be, and then I step away from it, and then the people take it from there. What happens is that I became that inflection point for the beginning of the computer generation. I know it was Al Gore, obviously, but that was the internet. In any case, because he is the leading authority of his generation, there's something that there are two stories that we need to talk about, that it's not so much about what he taught us, but in print, so to speak, but two instances that will show his greatness, what it does to Jewish history, how it affects halacha at his time, and then how it affects halacha till this very day. If you opened up today a Mishnah Berurah, Shulchan Aruch, Pnini Halacha, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Chaye Adam, Chochmat Adam, anything that's halachic that you opened up today, with the exception of the Rambam, has its origin with this man. That's a big statement. We're going to see how that works. Won't necessarily get to all of it tonight. I mentioned that in Blois in 1171, that as a result of a blood libel, there were many Jews who were taken hostage and held for ransom. Maram Rothenberg was taken. He was arrested. He was taken into jail for whatever reason, and the government said, "We will be more than happy to let your leader go on one condition." The emperor had him imprisoned. He demanded a huge ransom, and the community was willing to pay. Now, parentheses for 1 second. I don't recall if I know that last year, Rob and Lisa Zettelman's son-in-law, who was here when their son Ari Zettelman, Hashem Yikam Damo, was killed in war. When he was here, he gave his son-in-law gave a shiur about the topic of Hatufim, people who've been kidnapped, and the halachot and things that have been over the centuries. And yeah, it was wonderful. I posted it in my YouTube channel, and I asked him for his permission to give his shiur in his name at some point. And I did. I gave it some, not here in Baal HaTurim. It was outside Baal HaTurim. I don't think I gave it here online. Maybe I'll do that when we finish this section of these people. I'll give that shiur in his name. But the difference in the times of the rules and regulations over the centuries of when Jews have been taken captive, whether it's Marame Rutenberg, or it was Entebbe, or it was going on right now, the reasons in general for why people have been taken captive in the past versus why they're being captive today are so radically different. The halachot have changed over time. You might be thinking, you may know that there's a mitzvah that says that if someone's taken captive, that you're even allowed to sell a sefer Torah to ransom the person. And usually that's correct, but not always. What is it? So the two main sections this breaks down into are if if people are kidnapped for ransom versus people are kidnapped as in today, have nothing to do with money. It's all about hatzalat nefashot, getting them back. You don't get them back, God forbid, they could be killed. And all the different rules and how that works out. So we're going to just focus for now on the story of Marami Rutenberg. He's in jail, some trumped up charges. And again, the purpose of him being in jail is the emperor wants to raise a lot of money. He knows that the Jews are going to do anything they can to save their rabbi. He was getting considered the main halachic authority of Ashkenazi Jewry. And the community says, we will pay the ransom. And what does Maram Rutenberg say? You're not going to pay. He doesn't want to pay. Even though the halacha states that one of the times you're allowed to pay an exorbitant sum of money, even though you assume maybe someone might get kidnapped because of that and they want to get more money, is when it's like a gadol hador or someone's like a great chacham. He said no. He said, because I am afraid that if you pay this ransom, another rabbi will be arrested, and maybe I'll get arrested again, and it's just going to cause tremendous burden and strain. And he stayed in jail. He wouldn't let himself he wasn't tortured. He just stayed in jail. And he was able actually to continue writing, and he was able to still sort of teach. People sort of came to the prison. And he stayed there for 14 more years, believe it or not, until he died. He stayed there for another 7 years until he died. But the emperor was so mad that he was not able to get money out of the community that he held his body for 14 more years in the prison, buried in the prison floor, and he left the body there. Finally, a man named, I have it here, some I know somewhere, Alexander Vimpin. Sorry, I don't know who it was. Redeemed the body. He says, I'm going to redeem the body for an exorbitant amount of money, but on one condition, that when eventually I die, I want to be buried next to him. You're going to take him, exhume his body, put it in a Jewish cemetery. I want to be buried next to him. And that request was actually honored. And after that, for a very, very long time in Europe, the governmental authorities did not capture rabbis or others specifically for ransom. Again, I may give a separate shiur on this at some point. I don't really want to get too much into it now because I'm not prepared to talk about it now, but we will, Bezrat Hashem. There was another event that took place. That's one story of the Marami Rutenberg. There's another event that took place. The Maharams is his initials, and Rutenberg is the city he lived in. There's another event that took place that some of you are familiar with that I already talked about tangentially a while ago. But I'll get a little bit more in depth about what actually happened. Keeping in mind that until late 15th century, mid to late 15th century, there is no printing press. And in Paris, France, which has always been such a welcoming city for Jews, especially today, they're welcome everywhere. I should have like a little sarcasm alert go on the screen. On Erev Shabbat Parashat Chukat in the year 1244, 24 cartloads of handwritten Gemaras were burned. They took them to the public square and burned them. The reason I'd mentioned this before as an aside was that when we talk about the Rambam, and Rambam was put into Cherem, is excommunicated by some communities, when this event occurred, which was after the Rambam died, not that many years after, Rabbenu Yonah said that this burning of the Talmud was a direct punishment from God for the putting Rambam into Cherem and burning some of his books. Now, this is a vast loss. It is thousands and thousands and a Gemara in today's printing. A Gemara is 2,711 pages for one set. This is 24 cartloads. I can't even imagine how many folios, again, handwritten, how many were burned and destroyed. It was a massive, massive loss. Who stood there? Who was among the people who stood there and watched it happen? None other than our dear Maharam Rutenberg. And he composed a kina, an elegy, like a mournful poem, that is read on the morning of Tisha B'Av, which is called Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh. I think I actually have let me see if I have that here. I don't think I put it in a No, I'll show you a different slide though. Now, that happened, as I said, on Erev Shabbat Chukat in the year 12 of the Common Era, to the year 1244. Now, why is that important to know? So I'll show you. Do a screen share here. Okay. A little known halacha. It's not a halacha. It's halacha slash custom. We're calling it a custom. It's not halacha. That's mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Magen Avraham. Magen Avraham was a commentary in the Shulchan Aruch. And what was the Shulchan Aruch? We're actually on the way to getting to that point. We still have about another 100 years, not us, but about 100 years in this timeline to get to it. Okay, so here's what we're going to see. Katav Atanya, B'yom HaShishi, Parshat Chukat. Nagu Yechidim Lehitanot. There is a custom. This is the only fast day. And to this day, there are some who do this. That is tied to a certain day of the week and parasha, and not to a date. Parshat Chukat can be, bonagid, in July, mid-July, early July, late. It could be, it fluctuates depending on the time of the year. But it says that there are those who have a custom on Friday of the week in which Chukat is, Parshat Chukat, that some people have a custom to fast. Why? Now he has it as 20 cartloads. Most sources say it was 24 cartloads of Gemara were burned in Tzarfat in France. And they didn't establish the fast day based on a date, like, for example, the 10th of Tammuz, 10th of Tevet, or the 17th of Tammuz. Why? This is fascinating. There was just make it easy to say, in a dream, it was seen that that it was specifically that week, that parasha, that it caused that day, caused that to be burned on that day. It says in the parasha, Zot Chukat Torah. It says the first three words of the parasha, Zot Chukat Torah. This is the chukim, the statutes of the Torah. Mitagamina, and the Unkla says, Da Gzerat Oraita. This is the Gzera of the Torah. This is the decree of the Torah. So they took that the rabbis at the time took that, Rami Rutenberg, and understood that to mean that this is a Gzera. This is a decree from God that specifically that the Torah was burned, that the Torah, the words of the Talmud were burned on Friday, Erev Shabbat, Parshat Chukat. So there is a custom among some to actually fast on that day. Okay, so that's something you now know, that you may not have known before. So if anyone ever tells you there's a fast day that has to do with a relative to a parsha and not to a date, the answer is yes. As I said, the Maharam Rutenberg, plays the major role, if not the greatest role, in the development of our current halacha, the Shulchan Aruch. And we're going to have to see how that plays out, because we have to first start by discussing a man named the Rosh. The Rosh we spoke about already. We spoke about him because even though we're now in the Ashkenazi world, we talked about him in the Sephardi world, because if you remember properly, that he started off in the Ashkenazi world and he had to run because he was being oppressed, whatever the right word is, I don't know that word. And he had to run. He ends up going to Spain, and he settles there and he becomes a Rav there, and he's accepted in the Sephardi community. So he played in both worlds. But now I'm going to give you just a little bit more about the Rosh, because now we're dealing with him back in the Ashkenazi world, because you have Marami Rutenberg, one of his main students is the Rosh. The Rosh was Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. He's in the late 13th into the 14th centuries. And the reason that he's so critically important is that he, along with the Rif and the Rambam, who we talked about, both of them back in the Sephardi world, are known to be the three pillars of halacha. What does that mean, the three pillars of halacha? I keep saying we're going to get to it, but when we do, hopefully still this evening, and we talk about the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, the decision of how to say what the halacha is when there's dispute or disagreement, boils down to these three opinions, and who is like where's the majority rule. Also, all three of them, the Rif, whom we spoke about, the Rambam, whom we spoke about, and the Rabbenu Asher, or the Rosh, who we're going to speak about now again, all had some form of writing that was halachic as well. It started to, because remember, from the time the Torah was given, all the way to the time of the Rambam wrote his Mishnah Torah, there is no real book of halachot, except that the Rif does compile, we saw this already, compile a list of halachot that attaches as a commentary, so to speak, on the Gemara. So there's still no real book. Even now, at this point in history, there's no Shulchan Aruch yet. There is no official code of Jewish law as we know it. But with these three people, the Rif, the Rambam, we spoke about, and the Rosh we'll talk about now, those three are the three legs upon which the Shulchan Aruch eventually will stand. This time period, as I say, was a time period of terrible persecution for the Jews, the Ashkenazi Jewry, which was not the same in the Spanish world yet, which is not coming for another, well, it's coming another century later after this. So that's why, because the Rosh was afraid that he was going to end up in the same boat, so to speak, as his teacher, the Marami Rittenberg, and maybe get kidnapped, he decides to run. He goes to Spain, settling in Toledo, which we spoke about already, and becomes a leader in the Spanish Jewry. But again, he is unique in the fact that he is recognized both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi worlds as an absolute authority in halacha, in both opinions, in both ways. His probably the most famous thing that he did was at the end of if you have a Gemara at home, or if you don't, next time you're in the library of a shul or somewhere, take out a random Gemara and open to the back. After the Gemara is finished, you will come across a section called Chidushei HaRosh. And in there, the Rosh, spelled like Rosh. I pronounce it Rosh. It's also pronounced Rosh, like head. You will find that he has his Chidushim, but what he does there is he gives all the different like little pieces from the Gemara, where the Gemara has all the back and forth and discusses and doesn't always come to a conclusion. He tells you what he says, what the halacha is. And he felt what is correct based on his knowledge and his teacher, i.e. the Maram Rutenberg and others. Because it's impartial, it doesn't just follow only one opinion, and he takes into consideration the greats that came before him. His commentary and his compilation of the halachot, the Jewish law on each thing, was widely accepted, pretty much as indispensable. I will tell you that when a student starts to learn Gemara in school, they generally start learning Gemara by doing the Mishnah and the Gemara on that Mishnah. Then they upgrade to getting the information that Rashi explains it. Then the next step is to add Tosafot, which we just discussed with Tosafot. The next level up generally is the Rosh. Then you say, okay, we finished the Gemara, we got to a certain point, now let's turn to the latter part, the end of the Gemara, the physical volume, and we're going to look at the Rosh. The Rosh will give a little synopsis and what his feeling is for the halacha. But he didn't just deal with halacha. I will tell you honestly, I didn't, until I was doing my research for this class, there was something I'd heard of, but I didn't really know what it was. And I came across it, and I'll show you. He also wrote a sefer that, get it here on the screen. Oh, here we go. So I don't get this black line. Let me get rid of that. Okay. Okay, just a second. Okay. He wrote a book called Orchot Chayim, which kind of means like the paths of life. Not really, but I'm just going to use that example. And it's important to know that he called it that because of something that's coming up. What is it? It's a compilation of ethical ideas, how to treat people, how to act. It gives moral advice. This is just a picture of like the chapters and what it's about. We'll look at a couple of them in a second. Not the chapters, just what these say. Basically is like his advice, for example, don't act in a rush. Don't be quick to decide things. Ask for forgiveness, but when you said slach lanu, forgive me, and Shemona Esrei that you didn't have any intention when you said it, Don't attempt to rationalize or reason with a crazy person because your words will be ridiculed. And actually, in some yeshivot, till this very day, in the month of Elul, leading up to Rosh Hashanah, many yeshivot will learn this. So it gives us just look at a couple. Aleph, to get as far away from possible as any kind of hubris. Also, not trying to ingratiate yourself with somebody else. Honest, be honest. Again, this is a theme that he talks about. Also, you should distance yourself from falsehood and lies. And leitzanut, this word here, laziness, which we're talking about now in our Pirkei Avot class. And also distance yourself from speaking Lashon Hara. And on and on and on. They're all different ideas here that he tells us in his book that we want to make sure that if you learn it, it tells you how to comport yourself, how to act as not just keeping mitzvot, which is of course important, but how to act, how to be a person. The Rosh had a son. His name was Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher. He was known as the Baal HaTurim. Remember, we had, this is important, I'm sorry for repeating, but it's very important. We had Marami Rutenberg. His student was the Rosh, among others. And the Rosh did all this writing of halakha, commentary on the Gemara. And after him, his son, I'll just refer to him as the Baal HaTurim, takes the next gigantic step in codifying Jewish law. It's a broad statement, but it's so true. We're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about the Turim, Arba Turim, what that means in English and what it is, how it becomes the eventual Shulchan Aruch, which we will not get to tonight. But we're going to start with something that's not as well understood. That's not understood. It's just people don't realize it's the same person. There's an expression of a person's a Renaissance man. I guess there's Renaissance women too, but the expression is a Renaissance man. It's a person who has ability to do so many things in so many different areas and is good at them. You know, a person may be good at philosophy and astronomy, and there's a doctor, and they can balance their checkbook. No one said it anyways. But whatever, all these things, they're Renaissance men. So I would kind of go on a limb here and out on a limb and say that the Baal HaTurim was a Renaissance man because of his ability to do so much. No computers, all in his head. So let me we're going to talk about two things: the lesser known and then the greater known. The lesser known is if you open up a Chumash and you have ones like a Mikrot Gedolot that has many commentaries on the Chumash, you will find very often, sometimes very little teeny words, the commentary of the Baal HaTurim. The person we're speaking about right now, i.e., the man who is the son of the Rosh, his name again is Yaakov ben Asher. He's in the late 13th, early 14th century still. Is this person we're talking about, the Baal HaTurim? What is it that he did regarding the Chumash and Torah? Let's take I think I made one slide of that. Let me see, not that. Yeah, okay. Okay, in this week's parasha, let's move this around so you can actually see it. Okay. He does gematria. He says that this is the one of three places in the whole Tanakh that appears a certain word or a phrase, and he then sometimes tries to combine them. Other times he leaves it up to us. He'll say that this unusual word is mentioned here, it's mentioned in Eov, it's mentioned in Tehillim. And that's it, he'll leave it. But he doesn't mean it just to say, oh, this is cool, I found three places. He does it because he wants you to look at all three and see what's the connection. That's the goal. Sometimes he explains a word, and this is one of those places. In this week's parasha, that's why I chose it. Remember, there's this whole discussion here that how is it possible? Sarah says, I'm an old woman, Avram's an old man, how am I gonna have a baby? And she said, Who would have said to Avram that Sarah would suckle children, yet I have borne a son in his old age? This word milel is an unusual word. So the Baal HaTurim picks up on it. He says two things. One here, bet, betray lishne. It's mentioned twice, this word, in Tanakh. Remember, he doesn't have a computer. I'm not saying this being facetious. I mean, he knew the entire Tanakh by heart. He says there's two places it appears. Pacha, here in this parasha, ve'idach, the other places, shomer ma milel. Medaber b'mapalat Aram. The pasuk, shomer ma milel, is discussing the downfall of Aram. Lomar, to tell us, shebischut Avraham, because of the zechut of Abraham and his having children and what he did, mapalat Aram. Aram will fall. So he's not only telling us that it appears in two places, he's making a connection. Aram falls in this pasuk, Shomer Ma Milel, which is that section is discussing the downfall of Aram, the people of Aram, and he's connecting here to Abraham to say that the Zechuyot of Abraham is what allowed that to happen. Why Dafka them? That's a different. He's from Aram Naharaim. That's where Abraham was from. Then he tells us something else. Milel, the gematria kuf. The gematria, the numeric value of mem, 40, 30, and 30 is 100. To tell us, Kisheya Abraham ben kuf, to tell us when Abraham was 100 years old, that his wife Sarah was nursing a child. So again, this is something else very special that the Baal HaTurim does. And again, some people will look and go, "Oh, that's cute about a gematria," but you don't say that's cute when it comes to his work, because is so much depth that it's not just important to understand the gematria. You have to understand another layer below it. I don't know if there are super commentaries on the Baal HaTurim, means commentaries on his commentary. I'm not sure. But especially very frequently he says, again, it appears twice, it appears 3 times in Tanakh, 4 times, and he quotes them. What I think would be a great sefer to write, if it's not, I'm sure it exists already, is then to say where these 3 places are, what is the context of each 3, and then how are they connected? What do we learn from each one? If that sefer doesn't exist out there, maybe it's one that should be written. Now, the next thing he did is going to take us about 20 minutes to discuss, which we'll put off till next week. But I will just tell you in general. He is called the Baal HaTurim. Turim are columns. If you go back all the way to the time of the Mishnah, remember we said that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi took the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, and set it into 6 sections, which we refer to as the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 sections of Mishnah. Not until the Rambam is anything put into sections, and then he writes the Yad HaChazakah / Mishnah Torah, and he writes that and divides it into 14 major sections, hence the name Yad HaChazakah. Yud Dalet is 14 in Gematria. The next thing that happens when it has a number is the Baal HaTurim writes something called the Arba'a Turim, the 4 columns. What are those 4 columns? Why does he call it that? What do they represent? How do they end up becoming the Shulchan Aruch? That, Bezrat Hashem, we will deal with next week, because it is something that is, again, Barami Rotenberg affects us today, the Rosh affects us today, the Baal HaTurim affects us today. All this is one long chain of events that brings us to books that everyone has either on their shelves, on their computer, or in Beit Midrash. To be continued, Bezrat Hashem, next week.